Hi, and thanks for tuning in to the Birth Words podcast. In today's episode number 3, I will be telling the story of my first birth experience.
You're listening to the Birth Words podcast. Utah-based birth doula and applied linguistics scholar Sara digs into the language of pregnancy and birth to help expectant women claim their power as life-giving agents engaged in a praiseworthy work. This podcast aims to promote positive birth paradigms and is not intended as medical advice.
Welcome to episode number 3. I have named this episode Emergency, and it goes back to a quote that I shared in the first episode from Gail Tolley of Spinning Babies Mastermindness. She invites birth workers to view birth as emergence rather than emergency. And I just loved that quote when I read it because I think that all too often in our society, birth is viewed as an emergency. And there are certainly cases in which that is warranted. And I am not going to deny that that is the case. But I think that it's overly viewed that way. And I'm going to tell a story today about my birth of my twin daughters that was in many respects an emergency. I wanted to start this story by framing it with a quote from Dr. Sears, the Sears Healthy Pregnancy book, which I really recommend as a nice, well-rounded pregnancy book with a positive, upbeat tone. He says, "We prefer the term high-responsibility pregnancy over high-risk pregnancy. Our term goes beyond using specialized medical care and a high-tech hospital. It implies that you must take greater responsibility for your own care and your own birth decisions. Instead of resigning yourself to the high-risk label, becoming a passive patient, and leaving all birth decisions up to your doctors, become a high-responsibility mother. Take an even more active role in your birth partnership. Cooperation between you and your care providers is essential. You need to be more informed and more involved in decision-making than the average mother, and you need to take better care of yourself. The first question you should ask your doctor after you are classified as high risk is what specific things you can do to lower that risk. The term high risk is unnecessarily scary. Hearing the term naturally makes you wonder, risk of what? So I came across this quote sometime in the last year, and I was really moved by it because my first birth experience, we'd struggled with infertility for a while. I took Clomid, and on the second cycle, we were pregnant. And at 10 weeks, we went in for an ultrasound and found out that they were twins, which is slightly higher rate of twin pregnancies for Clomid moms, but certainly not the norm. I think it's about 10%. So from 10 weeks into my pregnancy, I was given this label of high risk, and I was young and totally unfamiliar with twin pregnancies and birth generally and everything. And so I just accepted the label of high risk pregnancy. And I had always planned to give birth unmedicated. I believe that's because that's the way my mother did it. And she talks very positively about her birth experiences. And I knew that I could do it. But when I found out that I was pregnant with twins and I got this high-risk label, I decided that must be out the window. I read a couple of things that suggested that mothers with twin pregnancies should get an epidural. I didn't think much more about it and said, well, I guess that's the route I'm going to go if that's what should be done. And I really just, throughout the pregnancy, did what Dr. Sears cautions us not to do, which was I resigned myself to the high-risk label, became a passive patient, and left all birth decisions up to my doctors. I asked questions and I prepared, but not to the extent that I would have if I was in the same situation now. So things got a little more complicated when I was 30 weeks pregnant. I started having contractions regularly. Every 10 to 15 minutes, I was teaching at the time. And I remember every time I had a contraction, I would just write down the start time on a sticky note. I still have the sticky note in my wallet. And every 10 to 15 minutes, I was contracting, and I was only 30 weeks pregnant. And I went into the hospital after school, after laying down for a couple of hours, trying to see if maybe I just needed to drink some more water and rest and they'd slow down. And they didn't, and they remained pretty constant. And I went to the hospital and they checked my cervix, and I was dilated to about 3 centimeters, and they kept me there for a few hours. And during that time, I dilated an additional centimeter. And so they said, you're staying here until these babies are born. You are staying at the hospital. And I became a long-term patient at the hospital that day. And I just laid in bed for weeks and weeks, 4 weeks at the hospital and then another 5 days at home, and 6 maybe. And I just tried to not let these babies come out. They gave me steroid shots for their lungs to help them develop, since there was a high likelihood they'd be born prematurely. They gave me medication to slow down my contractions. I had to take some medication every 4 hours for those 5 weeks to try to slow the contractions. And then at 35 weeks, the contractions got stronger and stronger, even though I was still popping the nifedipine every 4 hours. And we decided to go into the hospital, and they checked my cervix again, and I was dilated to 6 centimeters. And then I kind of went back into hospital patient mode, which was tricky because the paradigm that I had been in for those 4 weeks was that I was at risk, and I was, and there's no questioning that, of delivering these babies prematurely. I was at risk of that happening, and I had very much just been a passive patient in the hospital bed, and then my own bed for a few days. And that, I think, really affected the way that I approached my birth experience once it was time to give birth to these babies. So, having been accustomed to staying in bed, I got into bed, and shortly after I arrived, got an epidural. And then my contractions stopped coming as regularly for a while. And so in response to that, my nurse said, okay, we're going to give you some Pitocin. And I remember thinking, I have been laying in bed for 5 weeks to try to not have these babies. And now they're not coming fast enough. You've got to make them come faster. But I didn't say anything. I just said, well, I guess that's what I should do. So I got some Pitocin. It didn't really speed up the contractions. The doctor broke my water, and that had the intended effect of quickly speeding up my contractions. I believe I was 7 centimeters at that point, and I dilated to the full 10 centimeters within about 40 minutes, and I was ready to push. And I honestly can't remember the exact order that things happened. I was wheeled to the operating room because, according to hospital protocol, that's where all twins are birthed. But around the same time that they were making that transfer, my baby B, that means the baby that was on top, her heart rate dropped. And they tried to get it to go back up. They gave me some oxygen. That didn't help, and it didn't go back up. And so they decided that I needed an emergency C-section to save my baby's life because her heart rate had dropped. And so very quickly I was prepared for the surgery. And I had an epidural, as I mentioned. It wasn't super strong. And so when they started the operation, I could feel the scalpel, and they moved a little lower. I could still feel it. So the anesthesiologist gave me some strong medication through my IV and said it would make me a little loopy. And I don't remember a lot of what happened for the next few hours because it did make me rather loopy. I remember that the ceiling was swirling blotches of color. I remember taking a long time to remember what my name was, what my husband's name was, and why I was at the hospital. And then I remember my baby A being born, and they brought her by my face and said, "Did you want to kiss your baby?" And I tried to do so. I couldn't coordinate the movement of my lips very well because I had a lot of drugs in my system. And I remember just things going really quickly. The nurse writing their birth times on her arm because there wasn't time to write it anywhere else. And I remember the anesthesiologist staying by my side and checking in on me, especially after my husband left with one of the babies, or perhaps both. And it was an emergency. And I look back on that experience, and there's a lot that you can't deny would be an emergency from whatever perspective you view it from. And there are also things that I wonder if I had viewed myself as a high responsibility mother rather than a high risk patient. If that had been my perspective, if I'd used that language to frame my identity, what would I have done differently? What may have gone differently? Would I have asked more questions about the interventions that were being offered to me? Would I have asked to be given some time to think over whether I wanted Pitocin at the point that they offered it? Would I have asked for some time to wait and see what happened rather than breaking my water? Would then things have turned out differently? And I could ask questions all day long, and I'll never know the answers. But I do know that the feeling I took away from that experience was that of a disempowered patient. I was just reading over this birth story as I wrote it shortly after the twins were born. And it was interesting to look at my language, the way that I told the story as more of a passive participant than an active agent. And again, there are times that emergency arises in birth and that it's appropriate to rely on the awesome and amazing expertise of the medical care team. And there are times when it's important as a birth-giving woman to pause and say, "Can you tell me more about this intervention that you're suggesting? And what are some possible alternatives? And what could happen if I chose this choice versus that? And is the baby safe currently? Am I safe currently?" And those are important questions that we don't always ask. I noticed that in my retelling of the story, I said a couple of times that I'd been hoping for a vaginal delivery, which is just kind of interesting on a couple of levels. But I'll talk about two interesting words in that phrase that I read in my story last night. One was that I was hoping for a vaginal delivery. Hoping. I didn't really prepare for it. I hoped that it would happen. But I didn't think there was a lot I could do to prepare for it. I accepted a label of being high risk, and I didn't ask a lot of questions, and I didn't make very many informed decisions about my care and what I could do to increase the possibility of having that goal that I had, that I would have a vaginal birth. So the other word that's interesting is delivery. And lots of people who talk about birth in language take issue with the term delivery, especially when it's used in the context of a doctor delivering the baby, because it puts the agency in the hands of the doctor. He's the subject, or she's the subject delivering the baby. And it doesn't give nearly enough, just wonder and admiration and awe for the birth giver who is laboring for hours and working and pregnant for months and is really the one doing the work here in this situation. So that was an interesting phrase to come across. I just found continually as I read it that I was putting myself in the position as an object, not as a subject. That in this doctor-patient relationship, I was definitely just being a patient. And again, there are things that I would change about that experience. There are things that I couldn't change about that experience. And I do believe that I received quality care and that my needs were looked out for. But I also believe that things could have been done differently if I had risen up as a high responsibility mother rather than being a high risk patient. So that concludes my story for today. Tune in 2 weeks. I'll be telling a rather different story about my son's birth. And next week we'll be talking a little bit more about discourse. So I hope to hear from you. Send your ideas and suggestions. Tell me if you want to share your stories, and I will see you next week. Bye.
Did words play an important role in your birth experience? If you're interested in sharing your story on the podcast, go to summitbirthutah.com/birthwords. If you're liking what you hear on the podcast, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or wherever you choose to listen. For more resources about harnessing the power of words to benefit the birth experience, visit summitbirthutah.com/birthwords.